Hi, on my channel I have a video about how I draw bodies, and in it I very quickly went over how I draw poses, but for this video I wanted to go deeper into that. I will share some tips and tricks that I have learned over the years, as well as do some pose studies since I am actually not that great at drawing poses. Keep in mind that I am not a professional and my techniques aren't perfect, but if any of this is useful to you, then I'm glad. So I usually stick to more casual poses, I would say, of a character standing, maybe sitting sometimes when I find good reference. I don't really do something dynamic or dramatic that often, but I want to get better at that. This is probably one of the most, if not the most, complicated pose I've ever done, and I like it. It was fun to do. But yeah, usually I just make my characters stand. When coming up with a pose, I usually have a couple of rules in mind. First, I try not to make the pose too straight, if you know what I mean, unless I'm drawing a character base for reference or if it fits the character. I keep the pose asymmetrical and loose. Make one shoulder higher than the other. That's so hard to say. Turn or tilt the head, something like that. For the legs, I make one of them the balancing leg, I don't know what else to call it. Basically have one leg be straight and confidently on the ground, and then you can play around with the other to make it more interesting. Bend the knee, turn the foot to the side, lift up the whole leg, anything. It makes the pose more visually interesting, but it also looks like your character is actually standing on the ground, you know. I do often struggle with the arms though. Usually I plan out the pose, but when I'm freestyling I can get stuck on the arms, where to put them, how to make it look natural or expressive enough. I feel like usually it's not too noticeable, but I know of it and I see it. I tend to hide one of the arms either in a pocket or behind the character's hip, and then the other arm does all the job. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I want to get better at it for myself. But I do think I've gotten better at perspective of the arms and not making them awkwardly long. I will pat myself on the back for that, but let's get to the studies. Okay, so first I wanted to do something more simple and just draw a body at a few different angles. I honestly just eyeball everything. My style is closer to realism, so I keep in mind the basic anatomy rules like elbows lining up with the waist, wrists lining up with the crotch and stuff like that. This is just what I decide to do, by the way. You can exaggerate and stretch your proportions how you want, but I feel like there should still be some rules to it. Anyway, you can see me using some guidelines here. I've never done it before, but I know it helps keep the proportions accurate. I did a side view and I was gonna do a back view as well, but I realized it's gonna be almost the exact same as the front sketch, so I scrapped that. Instead I did a half-turned view, I guess. I think I understand how to do these angles, I just don't actually do them that often. Maybe if I was still working on my comic, if it would have been useful, but it is what it is. What I really struggle with is perspective, specifically when it's like an above or below view. I need to practice that more. But this was a nice warm-up, and then I moved on to studying actual poses. I tried a few methods here. First I decided to try referencing the photo like normal, then tracing over the photo and comparing the two. The first pose wasn't too bad, it's pretty close to what I usually do, more on the casual side. Something I learned from this is that I tend to make the poses not quite as expressive as the reference. They're not bad on their own, just need a little more stretch. This pose is a pretty good example of that. I had to go back and liquefy the body a little bit to match the reference, but I still had a lot of fun with this one. Also, please ignore if the body type on my sketch is different from the reference. I'm focusing on the poses here. The next pose was a little bit more complicated for me because it's a back angle. I also realized that I was trying too hard to make the sketch clean instead of actually sketching and breaking down the pose. It's a sketch, it doesn't have to be neat and clean. But yeah, this one was rough. It took me quite a bit of time and it turned out pretty stiff, I think. If this wasn't a study and I was making an actual drawing, I probably would either trace the reference and use that as a reference, or just trace over the pose, which is not the best, but you know. Yes, I'm using that same model again. Anyway, this pose was actually quite fun for me to do, and I didn't even have to fix the sketch that much. I drew this pretty quickly, didn't really do much with the sketch, just like made it less white at the end. And yeah, this pose is pretty cute, so I think I'll use it for a drawing. But I found it kind of tricky to first reference the photo, then trace the reference and compare that. So for the next pose I switched it and I first trace my reference, like breaking down the pose, the body and everything, and then I use that as my reference. And for me that was actually much easier because I can actually see all of the guidelines. But with this pose, I don't think I quite got the perspective right. It's more like a side view and not a below view, if you know what I mean. So I'll need to work on that. But I still like the sketch. I don't usually draw stuff like this, but who knows, maybe one day I will. It's still a useful skill to have. This next pose wasn't that hard for me, so I'm not sure why I picked this reference. I kind of have an understanding of how to draw these sitting poses, like seductive poses, but I don't know, just for some variety, I guess. I don't draw stuff like this often either, but I think if I feel like doing it, I'll be fine. Next is another sitting pose, but this one was kind of tricky for me. You'll see my sketch it looks fine, it just doesn't quite match the reference. The reference I think just looks like a person like sitting, stretching, and my sketch looks exhausted, like really tired. Maybe it's the back. Yeah, it's the back. This next pose looked really interesting to me, so I decided to include it as well. And I actually thought it would be harder for me, but I kinda got it pretty quickly. I'm kinda running out of things to say. Yeah, this pose is cool. Marceline in this pose would look really cool, I think. We'll see. Maybe I'll draw her like that. But yeah, my technique here of tracing the reference and referencing that is really helpful, actually. Well, it works for me, but yeah. I usually don't do full-on studies like this. Usually when I want to practice a pose, I just incorporate it into a drawing, you know what I mean? But here I just did some sketches for a change. With this next pose, you'll see I have a similar problem that I mentioned previously. I understood the pose, I think, but I just didn't quite get the perspective right. On the reference it's an above angle, but my sketch just looks like, I don't know, a little bit above, but not enough, I guess. I really need to work on my perspective. And the last but not least is a full back angle and, I don't know, plus size model for a change. I I actually low-key find it easier to draw bigger bodies. I don't know what's up with that. Maybe the shapes are more pronounced or something. I don't know. I just really enjoy drawing bigger bodies. I don't know, something about it is very therapeutic to me, I guess. And this pose was fun to do. My sketch isn't, exactly like the reference, but whatever, I still had a lot of fun, and like I said, this is the last study for this video at least. I didn't learn that much from this, besides that I need to practice perspective and making the poses dramatic enough, but yeah. And since I briefly mentioned tracing the reference, I want to show some examples of how I have incorporated tracing into my drawings, I guess. Because I believe that tracing can be a useful tool, especially if you aren't confident enough in your anatomy or pose skills. I've traced my references a couple of times. The examples I'm showing now were because I was drawing an actual person and I wanted to get their body type correctly. And when I trace the reference and then I use it as a guideline for my actual sketch. I don't just trace the photo and use that, because I think it usually looks a little bit off. Or I traced a couple of times just to save myself some time. Simple as that. But there is a difference between tracing your photo reference and tracing someone else's art. Unless you have permission, please stay away from tracing other people's art. Usually artists are against it, and quite frankly, it's pretty annoying when someone traces you, and on top of that, doesn't admit it. And before you ask, I'm one of the people that are against it. I'm okay with people referencing my art or taking inspiration, since that's exactly what I was doing when I was younger, but tracing my art is a big no for me. But this mostly goes if you post your art online. Offline, I think you can do whatever helps you learn. Kind of end of topic there. But this is it for today. A more simple video this time, but I hope at least some of it was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Like the video, subscribe, please. My other socials will be on the screen and in the description. Thank you again, stay safe, and bye!